planners, journalists, and designers, and an architect, landscape architect, I think. So a really broad range of interesting backgrounds. And most of the people who have shown their work in this show have other work that they do professionally. And we would like today to be a discussion amongst all of us, but also with our artists, talking about what it means to make art out of data, what it means to work with data creatively. So from there, shall we start asking some questions of the artists? Maybe you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, I'm Mariya. I have a background working as a interaction designer in tech, where I built systems to facilitate various kinds of processes. And prior to that, I have a degree in visual art and urban studies. So I'm currently getting my graduate degree in urban planning, and this was done in an urban informatics class, the project, where we studied sort of the validity of data, how to use it, and how to think about using data to influence and impact policy, and how to understand it, read it, work with it. And this project really came about when we were thinking about how we interpret cities and how we explain cities and express cities for various projects that we're working on as planners. And it really came out of a desire to do something more fun and representational and visual that sort of reflects our work as planners and reflects the values that we consider important in cities. So I'm really happy to answer more questions about the work, and really excited to be on this panel.
Cool.
So my name is Cameron. Presently I work as a data visualization engineer, but prior to this I worked on data pipelines at a public data startup. My background before working was in electrical engineering, but I was interested in design groups in campus, and was always interested to hear the variety of ways that people represented the domains that they work in visually or physically. So I would say that given how abstract most of the work that I do is, like, it deals with the health of computers which are in the cloud, I was looking, and my partner as well, Abe, we were both looking to find a way to make a physical data layer map more tangible, like something that people could touch and hopefully manipulate. I'm mixed about how closely we reached the making it tangible goal, but I am happy with where we landed as far as making it something that hopefully provokes curiosity. So I'm happy to talk more about that.
You want to start? Or?
Sure. So the spider graphs which currently are on the screen, you said that came sort of out of an interest of wanting to kind of like compile the things that you consider important in a city. How did you arrive at those, and how did you arrive at this sort of representation that's like sort of I guess different from many traditional data visualizations, in that it's trying to pack a lot of information into a small circular space. So just wondering if you could chat about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So there are some very practical limitations and restrictions as part of this project. We were learning how to work with Python, so that was our programming language at the time. And as planners, we're often looking at really large data sets that tell us about the built environment, the physical environment, and the people that are living in it. So when we thought about all those metrics, we usually show them in charts or in policy memos, or we really use language to talk about them. And we were really trying to capture the essence of a city through all those data points that we look at so often. And when we were thinking about how to represent it, initially we thought about a sort of like a little branding or kind of a logo or some kind of literal representation of each city that would capture the excitement, the sort of the cultural diversity, the various things that we think make cities really interesting to us as planners and also as people that live in cities. So the limitations that we had to work with was Python, and we knew we wanted to do something abstract, and it was an abstraction of an abstraction. So we abstracted data to express different layers and aspects of cities. And we actually had over 20 data points at some point in the beginning, and we were thinking about how to categorize them and how to put them together in ways that made sense to us. So the first layer represents population density and area, which is really a fundamental component of understanding a city, its scale, its population, and then what infrastructure is needed to support that population. And then the other layers, as we went, we really just, it was ongoing discussions about what we think makes cities special and how we could capture that through data and represent it. And then, in effect, represent it through this medium, which is a sort of a pattern kind of language that has a lot of variables that you can change and create the specific sort of forms that you see on the screen. And so we experimented for a really long time with those forms and with the forms that we thought best represented things like infrastructure and cultural diversity. So we experimented a lot with color, with size, with shapes, and with the density of the shapes themselves to represent what we thought the data meant from an experiential perspective as participants and at the same time as urban planners. So,
I have a question. It's interesting that you talk about how specific the representation is, because I also noticed in your description you talk about the inability of our data sets to actually tell that whole picture. Could you talk a little bit about how did you embrace that, or did you feel that you needed to pin things down with the way you encoded the visual representation of the data, or did you instead think about it a different way as you were working with it?
yeah, great question. We went back and forth on that a lot.
Yeah.
So we tried to make the shapes conform to the data and what we wanted to represent, but at some points we realized it was unruly, and a lot of the shapes and the way the colors interacted with one another said more to us at some point and wanted to represent things differently. So it was a constant sort of dialogue between us and what we kept surfacing with the shapes that we were creating and building. So it was a lot of pushing and pulling with it, and sometimes it didn't get ruly and we couldn't represent what we wanted to represent and had to pivot and think about different data points that would sort of fit, that would make sense with that particular shape that we liked.
Yeah. It's interesting to me because I feel like your project actually gets at that problem with representing data visually, that it almost puts that up for questioning, the systems that we develop. I like that.
I have a follow-up for you. I was wondering, as you're iterating on different forms to pick, did you find code to be the most natural medium to try things, or did you also like sketch or use other mechanisms to play?
That's a good question. We liked the restriction of the code because figuring out how spirographs worked mathematically was actually a really big challenge. So there was layers to the complexity that we didn't want to shift to different mediums. We did think about how to make this a little bit more tangible and literally print it or 3D print the actual shapes and surfaces, but that sort of went to another level of representation that we weren't sure was what we were trying to get at this particular point. But I think we felt that the code was a good sort of box to play in.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Want to talk about your work?
Yeah,
Sure.
I was going to ask, so your guys' representation ended up obviously using data sets and geospatial data sets in particular. This is it right here on the screen. But the representation is non-digital, and I wanted to flip your question on its head and ask why you chose the analog route.
Sure. There'll be a little bit of a setup first as to how we got to this form, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So Abe and I, we used to work together with a lot of public data sets, and we haven't been able to professionally do that for a little while, so this just seemed like a good reason for the two of us to look at all of the geospatial data in the data portal and just see what sort of questions might emerge organically. And after taking inventory and writing data pipelines over the Martin Luther King weekend, we found we had this question of there are 2,800-ish data sets in the data portal. About 2,000 of them are tables, and about 180 of them are geocoded. And the question that we kept asking was like, well, do we want to be able to see an overview for the whole city, or are we only going to be able to do like one special part of the city? Because there's a trade-off between having comprehensive, like anybody can get something from it, versus having enough level of detail that someone can look at it and say, this is a real place, and not just like this super tiny pixel. And in order to answer that question, we had to know what parts of the city were covered by each of these data sets. So that's where our project emerged. We ended up calling it Almost Everywhere because we wanted to focus on the parts of the city that did not have data coverage. Because that is the inverse of what would typically happen with a data map, right? You would have the spots with data points getting the most attention on them. So we wanted to flip that. Once we had made that choice, we actually filled out a matrix of 6 or 7 different options, all vaguely physically oriented. So I mentioned in my design background, or design club background in the past, I had played around a little bit with 3D printing, with laser cutting, with CNC milling, and we wanted to pick a solution that would let us to explore that world a little bit. Also, Abe had a friend who was very experienced with fabrication techniques, and we were hoping to lean on their expertise a little bit when deciding what to do. So the form that we ended up settling on, we wanted to play with light, we wanted to play with data layers, and we wanted to make it so that interactions between data sets would be relevant and someone wasn't just looking at one data set at a time. The nature of the acrylic that we worked with was such that after a certain number of layers, the light bends, and we didn't exactly get the properties that we were hoping for. Like, we didn't know what would happen when we started the project. But overall, I think when talking to somebody about what's happening in a data layer map, we were able to say there are 26 items here, and each one has data from one of the different New York City open data sets. If we had everybody wearing gloves, we would let people like touch it and pull out the different layers and compare how the different data sets have different data gaps in them. Yeah, so I've been talking for a little while, so I'll hand the mic back.
So can you name a few of the data sets? I mean, we're probably familiar with them, but, and then also I'm curious how your project changed, because when we first saw a description of it, it was different. And,
Yep.
and so it'd be interesting to hear about what kind of obstacles you ran into and why you made the changes you made.
Sure. So the original proposal was to work with everyone's favorite open data set 311 because it had the most comprehensive geocoding coverage, so we thought. Also because based on computational test runs that we had done, it seemed like it would take 1 week just to process the 311 data set, which is about 22 million rows. Abe came up with a solution using the PostGIS extensions in Postgres. If anyone's curious later, you should talk to him, which made it all happen in 2 minutes instead of 2 weeks or 1 week, which was revolutionary. So we thought, well, maybe we can work with some additional data sets, partly because we didn't really want to be in the business of analyzing the 311 to find specific insights. We would rather try to attempt to do something that hadn't, to our knowledge, that had been done before, which is to look at all the geospatial data at once. So some of the other data sets that ended up being included, besides 311, was the taxi data set, which even though it's named 2009, actually is 2009 until yesterday. It's still up to date. Link NYC, kiosk status, motor vehicle crashes, police complaints. We'll try to publish a list of all the data sets later. We have a GitHub repo for the project.
What does this show?
Yeah, so this particular outline is the neighborhood tabulation area. So the outer one is the NTA, and the one inside is a census tract or block. I think it's a tract, but it could be a block. And this is when we're, I think in the middle is the site where the exhibit is. So originally we thought we wanted to try to do all of the boroughs, but then the shapes would have been too small given the size that we were laser cutting them at. So this was a test run from before we included the taxi data. After the taxi data was added to this, all of the shapes vanished except for 4. And as a refresher, a shape appears if it's a planimetric polygon for which there are 0 data points from any of the New York City open data sets inside of one of those shapes.
Question for you, can I?
Yeah.
Question?
Yeah.
So how do you, you chose to make this a physical kind of object that people could look at. How do you think that experience changes for viewers in understanding and interacting and engaging with the literal, looking at the literal layers of data, as opposed to maybe seeing it's online or on a screen?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that a frustration that is possible to experience, like say if I made a map web app, is like I might spend a lot of time like making a tooltip or putting a menu somewhere, or making this cool thing happen. If you click on this part and then you watch somebody use it and they don't hover or they don't click or they don't discover these features that you spent all this time putting into it, because you people don't have a mental model for how the layers and all the, for what exactly you did with your web map, they won't necessarily explore it. Whereas if there's a physical piece and if we had gotten to the point that we let people touch it and manipulate it, it's very natural to be like, all right, to zoom, I'm gonna like move my head closer to the piece, right? Or I can take these 2 layers and stack them on top of each other and with my eyes diff what shapes are in one layer and not in the other layer. So we get to build on people's natural interaction vocabulary. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but people's natural sense for what to do when they're inspecting a physical object and how to ask questions of it, which is a language that they may not necessarily have for a web application, depending on their level of digital literacy.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question, thank you.
Yeah, I can also comment, because that makes me think about why we chose to make our work also as a video as opposed to just posters to show the emblems themselves individually on various other forms, was because we thought that the process of them forming was able to show viewers how these final emblems and final visuals and representations of each city happened and came about. So we really wanted sort of active representation of the process of creating them, though various narratives formed from viewers about the process of that creation of those shapes forming. But I think it was also a consideration for us in the physicality of the piece for people to see how it's forming and how it's happening, to understand where the source of the final visual comes from.
I think that's interesting when we think about the digital twin, because you're working between these 2 worlds too, making a physical representation. And I just heard that yesterday in the gallery, one of the other projects brought that is about a building in New York City that has the most violations, complaints against it in the whole city. And can we see if I can get to this or not? But sure. The artist Mona Chalabi brought in a group of people from the housing, from the building and the housing association where the building is, and I think it was probably great that they could sort of see this physical representation of the complaints that they have and the substandard conditions that they're living in because of this landlord. So like these 2 have been talking about, it's really a wonderful opportunity for people to bring data into this tangible reality. But, and I was wondering, I had a few, we have many questions, but I'll try to segue into something else. How do these projects, making these projects, because both of you do other things, how does this fit into your regular work life? And if you could explain that, and also why is it important to try to fit it in? I don't know who wants to go first.
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay. I'm ready. I'm going to think about it.
So I don't get to do any laser cutting in my regular job. What I do though is I work with maps, not of land, but of how computers are connected to each other. And there's also a communication challenge I think engineers face when trying to talk to their stakeholders about what sorts of things they need to know, or what sorts of things they need to be able to do to say that their system is healthy. And the way in which people explore maps in a computer is very like menu and clicking driven. So when I decided that this project made sense as a thing to spend like a lot of time outside of work working on, I viewed it as a chance to get to think about how people might explore a map-like thing. I don't think that, and I was very comfortable with the idea that like the work that I do at work is all about efficiency and getting people, like they have a predefined question and they want to answer it very quickly. This is not that. Like people probably were not asking the question, where are all the data voids in the city? And I think that just creatively, it's sometimes nice to search for the opposite of what you think that you actually need, because it may, one, it's just invigorating as a person, and two, maybe something will come out of it that indirectly helps something that's actually practical. But that's not the prime driver for why I would choose to do a project like this. Yeah, so hopefully that touched on something.
Yeah. I think for me, I work with quantitative and qualitative research and information a lot, and I think it's often hard to present that information or communicate it to people in ways that are effective. So I think in my day-to-day work, that's something I'm thinking about often, and I really lean on my degree in visual art for communicating a lot of those ideas and those values. And I think the interest in cities and understanding how cities function and how various players or actors or stakeholders support what exists in cities, whether it's city life, urban life, and literal infrastructure. I think it's really interesting to understand that through visual means, and I think, talking about the concept of the digital twin makes me think about how if we're moving towards a more rationalized way of understanding our world, in your case you're understanding how computers work, if we move towards that understanding in urban planning and of our cities and of our world, then it's becoming increasingly more important to be able to communicate those processes in ways that are more understandable and more approachable and accessible. And I think that's what we're moving to, and that's what I see, and I think creating work like this forces me to think about that a little bit more often and with greater scrutiny and nuance, given that I have learned about how to understand data and how to understand city processes and how everything works. And then, communicating that is, I think, another challenge that we're moving towards in a lot of different fields and areas. So I think doing work like this really challenges me in that way and pushes me to think about that a little bit harder. Yeah.
On that note, either with these projects that you've currently done or future projects that might be brewing in the back of your brain, what kind of an effect are you perhaps, I don't know, this may sound a little heavy, but like hoping to have as an artist? Like, what do you think a data artist's role in society can be, and how do you view your particular piece in that? Have fun.
Okay. Jeez, okay. Do you want to go first? Or do you want me to go first? Can you give me a minute? I'll freestyle. So I just want to point out that I think data is still inaccessible, and there is a divide that makes it hard to understand and hard to work with. And I think open data initiatives are absolutely amazing, and all the data we've used in our project has been from open data and sources of that nature. So I think it's really important, and I think my role is not only learning about how to use and work with data, but also expressing it in ways that I've learned in the past to, I guess, move people from point A to point B, whether it's in their feelings or their thinking, and to engage with that material, which is data, which is often inaccessible in the ways that we traditionally think about it, move them to a point where it becomes a little bit more accessible, or to have people think a little bit more critically about it, or its even representation, or the way it's created or processed or collected. So I think that's likely my goal, because as I've learned about it, I learned about all those nuances and how challenging it is. to collect data well and then interpret it and analyze it and then show it. So I think that's likely a role I would like to continue to play and like to continue engaging in with data in that way.
I think that something that is striking to me about data art is how interdisciplinary, or like the potential it has to be a bridge between, so for people who view themselves, self-describe themselves as more quantitative, or for people who describe themselves as more creative, to make it clear that that working with data is not a thing for just people from a certain silo, and that I think that people's decision to branch out to other things is not necessarily like a logical decision. It's a thing that's provoked by some sort of wonder or curiosity through something that spoke to them on an emotional level, and I would like to try and contribute to making bridges like that. A project that was done in the past that also tried to build this bridge was to make a Rube Goldberg machine of a data pipeline. A data pipeline is kind of an abstract thing to talk about, so we wanted to have a thing that literally showed gears turning and lights blinking and showing that work is being done. Like, you can't see it, but I promise you, like, we're sitting here at our desks every day and like things are being processed. And so that's why making something tangible and physical is hopefully something that more people can relate to. And even if they're not thinking about abstract data pipelines yet, knowing that like it's not that crazy, it's like an oil pipeline, except it's data flowing through it instead. Hopefully make people think maybe this is a thing that I could do, even though it's not something I was thinking about before. So yeah, I think the bridge-like aspect is the thing that I'm hoping to get.
I also want to add one thing. Something you said made me think about interdisciplinary work and cross-disciplinary work, and how important it is for people that don't consider themselves to be quantitative people or data people or even artists to utilize open data sets and to really like stay curious and get engaged and do more work with that, because I think that's where maybe interesting ideas happen or better questions happen that people that maybe are in the weeds with a lot of that work can't see because they're so deep within that work. So I think it's really important to have those conversations between individuals that don't usually work with data or don't consider themselves artists, but ask those questions and attempt to make those bridges that you're talking about.
Yeah, I liked all your answers, and as someone who's sort of new to working with data, but I have a long background as an artist, I've found what's also interesting as a converse is how creative people are when they're using data in the more pragmatic fields to solve problems. And what you both are doing and what other artists are doing is pushing those boundaries further by using data outside of a kind of practical application. And it's really great to hear about these goals that you have and how you're reaching them. And we wanted to sort of preserve plenty of time, a little more than other of the panels, for everyone else to join the discussion. So do you think it's time to, we'd love for you all to join in and either share your experience or ask a question of the artists.
And if you could use your talkback mic or whatever, that'd be great, because I think this is being live streamed. Maybe some of them don't work though, so that's part of it.
Can you hear me now?
Jack.
So I have a really obvious question, but it's something that I like to get other people's perspectives on. Just how you moderate the relationship between like aesthetic principles and more practical or operational, or really just like legibility concerns when sharing such like really huge data sets, and how you kind of offset that balance in a way that kind of retains creativity and also gets your point across. Because right now in a professional capacity, I'm making these procedurally generated maps for big fascination campaigns, but I can't really extricate myself from this desire to make these maps beautiful. Whereas in every reasonable sense, they should be just bare, ugly, to the point operational maps. Like, given my visual art background, I don't have the discipline to do that, so I wonder how I can approach that relationship professionally on these
this to them, but could everyone hear that question? Yeah. I think your vaccination maps should be beautiful.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone could repeat the questions
Yeah.
for the live
Oh,
stream.
were there some people who couldn't hear?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
The question was, hope I get it right, was how do you negotiate the desire to make maps that utilize data aesthetically pleasing in a role that's meant to be about clearly communicating or making them historically have not been visually pleasing. So how do you consider aesthetics in practical work or practical application, and how do you push those boundaries that like art enables you to do, but in a professional setting where you're trying to communicate to a lot of people, masses, you have to make as like reductive as possible in some ways. I think that's a really hard question. I think the thing that's worked for me was experimenting and providing options. It's also a really practical response. I don't know if you have the time constraints to really explore and experiment with more aesthetically pleasing maps, but at least in my experience, I worked on a report that, there's historically ways to present charts and maps, but working as a designer on the project, I managed to push the boundaries of how we could represent that and at the same time still make it accessible and legible and easy to read. So I think it's important to think about your question and to have it in the back of your mind, because I think that's the only way we move towards pushing boundaries on how aesthetics get incorporated into communicating that data and that information. So I would just continue to push and continue to present those as options, because I think it's a timing thing as well. Sometimes, certain places are not ready to change aesthetics or how they communicate, and sometimes they are. So I think it's important to continue pushing, experimenting, and, having some kind of proof that certain colors work better or certain messaging types work better is always really effective, I find, in workplace settings.
Did
Do
you
you
want
wanna
to
answer?
add?
Yeah, just to build on what Mariya said a little bit, I think that it's possible for a map to, there's a spectrum of attractiveness, but that doesn't necessarily mean sacrificing map legibility. And that there's an opportunity to, once again, build a bridge between what people think they want right now and just being one step beyond that. So an example that isn't directly map related, but I really like from Stephen Few, I think, is talking about when you have people who don't want data visualizations, they just want an Excel spreadsheet. It's giving them an Excel spreadsheet with colors on the background that are scaled based on the size of the number. And that's a stepping stone to being oh, I can observe things a lot more quickly than before. What else do you know about? And then this attitude switches from being oh, here's this person introducing this crazy art stuff that I'm not that into, I just want to solve business problems, to wow, there's this whole world of visual techniques that I haven't explored yet. What else can this person share with me? And I think if that team perspective flips, you'll have the opportunity to try a lot more, and everybody would be happier.
Back there, we have a question. Does your mic work?
No.
Mine's just kind of going off of what he was talking about. Yeah, so it's kind of a question, but also a query of, have you guys thought about, so this idea about legibility, data is kind of inherently, at least in my opinion, has a bias behind it. We choose to ask specific questions or query certain databases in certain ways to then model it. So is there a way to use art and aesthetics to neutralize data? And I think this is kind of a question for the artist too. Was there an agenda or kind of a goal with how you wanted people to view the art, the data art? And is there a way to express data art in a way that, neutralizes it, or even maybe kind of makes it almost even more confusing, abstracts it even beyond the point of legibility? And what do you think about that, I guess? Thank you.
whoever wants to take it.
Yeah.
Or if you have
I
initial
can take
thought.
it too. if you
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah, you work a lot.
I really like your question. I think that one of the things that was really exciting about working on this project is that we had an opportunity to look at work where the goal wasn't necessarily to give it the clearest representation, because often that's misleading. And I think this is something your project description said too, is like you can't give a full picture of a city with data at all, not even taking into account the inherent bias of the data sets that we might be using and how they were constructed. And making art projects through data rather than making a practical application of data visualization is the opportunity to complicate things. And I feel like both of your projects did, and a lot of the other ones were really looking specifically at the space between the picture data makes of a person or a place and the real thing, and how big of a gap there is. And using data in the ways that were used in a lot of the projects was an opportunity to kind of expose that and critique it and push boundaries to kind of question it. And I hope, this is segueing a little bit off to the future, but anyone here who's working with data and wants to participate in the show, please give us your email address so we can let you know, because we really want to bring in more work like that in the future. Who wants to talk next to that topic?
I can just briefly say one thing is a project I worked on before this, which explored the Flint water crisis, worked specifically with the lack of data and the bias in data as it related to the timeline of that crisis. And I think that the way we were visualizing that forced us to think about data in that way and actually show those biases more explicitly and examine what was missing rather than what was there in that particular data in that timeline. So I think using visual formats or art and creative formats to examine data is a really effective way of really finding out the nuances and picking out all the biases that you're referring to.
I think one thing I meant to say about your project and yours too is that one way that it brings that up for me is not so much in a direct way to say, here's what's missing, but instead to put out there, like, why are we encoding the visual representation in this way? Because they're both very aesthetic and they're less direct about what they're describing in a way. So you have to kind of get into it to decode it. And in that process, I believe it brings up what kind of systems we create to look at data. And so instead it's looking at how we do it rather than what it's saying. Cameron?
Sure. It's an interesting word to use, neutralize, with bias, because I was trying to think about, like, what would it mean to cancel these effects out? And if it's not a single dimensional thing, it's not like acid and base and you like balance it. So I think one can't necessarily hope to like swing the opposite direction of whatever bias there was in the data capture. All we can do is show a different one, which may not cancel it, but at least it gets people thinking that bias exists in the first place. So I think that just getting people to understand that each time you add a layer of abstraction, subjectivity goes into it, just getting people to consider that would be enough for me, as opposed to figuring out how to cancel out whatever bias was in the data capture process. To your second point about a hope for a takeaway, so our hope was that there would be greater variability in the data coverage maps for the data sets that we identified. And the reality was that for 80 of the data sets which we didn't print, they all looked the same. Like, we hoped for there to be variability and it wasn't there. And even for the ones that we did pick, like the variation in polygons that are cut out, it's under 60 across like the 25 things that we printed. So they don't look that different. So even though we had hoped that they would look differently just from a visual variety perspective, that wasn't the reality that we had to work with. I think an interesting contrast would be if we were to make one of these things out of some company's private data, like Yelp or Facebook or something. I assume that the map would be completely blank, because I assume that they have data about everybody. and that might be an interesting contrast. So the hope for the takeaway, I think, was that people understand that like open data, it is very comprehensive, but there are still a lot of gaps in it.
There are questions?
Well, we still have a few minutes, so we could keep going until they ring the bell.
Do you two have questions?
Either for us or the audience, or?
Yeah.
I have got one.
Right.
What would be like a dream project?
For these two?
Anybody?
I'll go first because that was top of mind that I didn't want to bring up because it was tangential. But we've been talking about a level of surveillance in cities and how to map that and how to visually express that, how to get that data, how to show it, and then how to sort of create some kind of just as a thought exercise, to think through of how heavily surveilled various spaces are and how you can calculate that based on without the private data that you would need to know that actual raw number. I think, and then, mapping that across time at different and geographically would be really interesting. So that's sort of a project that we talked about as unrealistic but very interesting and cool, or like impossible for us to do. Yeah.
It doesn't directly involve open data, but an area that I would like to work with is in the space of playground design and how data can encourage people to just think about engaging with this abstract stuff in a different way. So ideally, I would want to do something that involved some real-time data capture of people like doing some things in a space, and then somewhere else they could see charts or something generated from what they had done. And I think through this being a lower stakes activity, like people aren't doing this to analyze their health or anything, but it gets people thinking more creatively about what it means for data to be captured and how to interpret different types of visualization, like a scatter plot or more esoteric things which people may not have otherwise used before. So like thinking about using a thing to improve people's data literacy and engage with being outside would be a dream for me.
You guys, what are your 2 projects?
Just in working to curate and organize a show about digital twins, I was sort of, it got me thinking about how much information is out there on stuff that's in the physical environment, and I would like to figure out a way to visualize sort of the length of the shadows of those digital twins. So like what information is there about, each of us, but also like all the like self-driving car data that's out there, like, I don't know, in terms of quantity, possibly in terms of influence, like what is the impact of all of those digital twins, and how could you possibly compare them to one another to see, like, in essence, like what is the sort of digital DNA of our society headed towards? Because I don't have any clear view of that or clear understanding of that. Does anyone else have a question?
I think it's just a quick one. Staring at him this whole time. This, in terms of this paragraphs, like in the course of working with them, did you develop an intuition? So if you saw a new one, you'd have an understanding of what that city was like, or it speaks to legibility, I guess, and they're beautiful. And I don't see myself in the New York City one, for example, exactly. Yeah, maybe you could speak a little more about the experience of working with it over time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a good question because that was a frustrating experience. So we categorized all the data points to fit within certain breaks, and we really didn't know how each city was going to look, because it was like, okay, well, you get Y value and you get Z value and you get X value, and then we know what those values, the kinds of forms they would have shaped, but we didn't know how all those layers were going to interact with each other based on the colors we set and based on how we thought they were going to interact. So there was a lot of back and forth. We were like, okay, well, this poverty layer does not really articulate what we think is being represented in this city, or what we think the value should actually show about this city. And we went back and forth about a lot of the built environment layers, about how they should be scaled to express that they're still, housed within the overall area layer. So we went back and forth with a lot of times when they were forming to make sure that they were being expressed in the way that we had meant the metrics to be expressed, in the way that we evaluate those metrics based on the breaks and based on the categories that they fall into and values that they fall into. But to your point about New York has not represented, our idea of thinking about the spirographs was that when they are layered, they become a sort of a cohesive, single, kind of big and meshed and connected layer that we think of New York as being. And cities that are not that way because of things like lack of connectivity, because of increased dead ends, or lack of infrastructure because of, a lack of super tall buildings, which is related to zoning for us. So we thought that those were less connected cities, and cities that support less diversity, less density. And so those are the layers that we wanted to be very explicitly not feel connected, but still in the end beautiful, because we think ultimately they're all beautiful in their own different ways. And I think, one anecdote is that somebody came up to us and were like, oh, I really, really loved the shape. It really spoke to me. And she's like, and it happened to be the city that I'm from. And I just thought that was the most interesting experience for somebody to have had, that, despite our values as urban planners that we, projected onto all these abstract data sets, somebody still had some kind of an emotional reaction to a city that they were from. So, yeah. Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
And for what it's worth, when we were looking at these proposals, we all noticed that the spirographs were beautiful, but after I spent a bit of time studying what the different layers were and how they were drawn, I started to to interpret them as graphs.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I got to a point where I could guess which city it might be.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do spend enough time with these spirographs, they can turn into charts of a sort.
Mm-hmm.
And it is cool because they do layer on top of one another and form this cohesive impression, which I think not a lot of chart types tend to do. Cool question.
I have a question for you guys.
Okay.
Yeah. So as organizers and artists and data people, what did you want for the public to get from this event? We had a really great turnout opening night, and I think it's been really well received. So what were your goals in selecting the work, and what you wanted the public to get from the theme of digital twin and the work that they saw?
I'll try to be brief. I know one thing criteria that we had was that we had submissions that presented themselves more like a report or a practical solution to a data problem, and those weren't what we were looking for. We were looking for things that brought up questions or complexities, and I hope that it helps people to think about not only how they can be creative with data, but also just that using problem solving with data can be extremely creative and is a source of creative solutions in the world beyond the art projects. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I don't know that I had any conscious intentions. I was sort of invited onto the organizing committee in a sort of happenstance way. But in retrospect, I think subconsciously I was looking for sort of what you guys touched on earlier, which was imaginative ways of representing all this stuff that really is happening, everywhere. These data pipelines and these digital twins that are accumulating. And I was really interested in work that brings that to life and brings that into people's imaginations and makes it not only understandable, but sort of magical and I don't know, just mystical in a way as well. We have two other organizers here, and I don't know if they want to chime in at all, but
this is soy.
So one, I think, big goal in the starting of the exhibition, not by us, but by other organizers a few years ago, was to bring data, to make it more accessible to folks who don't have a technical background, don't have any background in data. And that's, I think, why there was this push to make an art exhibition, right? So that people walking down the street, I think our space this year does a great job of like reaching just random folks walking down the street and then coming in to see how learning, first of all, that there is such a thing as open data, and then also seeing how it can be used and all of the types of ways it could be interpreted and et cetera. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, yes. Submit for next year if you would like to be in the show, or if, you know, just keep making data art, even if you're scared of the spotlight. Yeah, I think the more of a culture we can have of this, the better.
Yeah, and the show is still up for 3 more days. The last day is Tuesday on Canal Street. And we will have a call for proposals out, we hope much earlier this year. And so